All right, I'm Rabbi Micah Streiffer. I'm the director and founder of La Asok, and I'm excited to spend the next hour with you talking about what is the Talmud anyway. So, I like to begin any study session with a blessing for study. So, this is one of those times when I'm going to invite you to unmute yourself so we join together in the blessing for study. That way, we can hear one another as we say this blessing together and sanctify the act of study. So let's say together. Baruch
Baruch
atah
atah
Adonai
Adonai
Eloheinu
Eloheinu
melech
melech
haolam
haolam
asher
asher
kiddushanu
kiddushanu
b'mitzvotav
b'mitzvotav
v'tzivanu la'asok
la'asok
b'divrei
b'divrei
Torah.
Torah.
And that means in Hebrew, blessed is the eternal whose mitzvot, whose commandments make us holy, and who commands us to immerse or engage in words of Torah. So as we begin to talk about the Talmud, let's start by just word associating. We'll use the chat feature for this. And I just want to ask you, what words, what ideas, what short phrases do you associate with Talmud? Let's just put them in the chat. Whatever comes up when I say Talmud, drop it into the chat so we can see what it makes us think about. All right, so I see commentaries, I see learning, wisdom, oral Torah, stories, arguments, laws and commentary, learning. Maimonides. Maimonides is a commentator on the Talmud as opposed to being in the Talmud, but he does speak about it. Stories, the Hebrew root. Yes, the root of the word Talmud means learn. Lomed means to learn. All right, so Talmud is interesting because it's very hard to boil down what is the Talmud. That's why the name of this class is a question. What is the Talmud anyway? Because Talmud is so hard to describe. It's not a book. It is a series of books, but they're not really books like anything we know outside of the Talmud. The Talmud is a unique literature in and of itself. I like Bob said, comments upon comments. Yes, absolutely. So I'm going to start here by sharing my screen, and I want to start with two opening stories. This first one is from, in fact, they both are from the Talmud, and in a sense, they will give us a sense of what Talmud is. So let me just share here. Da, 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 da. All right, some of these might be familiar to some of you, and you'll see where I'm going here. So this is a story from Tractate Menachot of the Talmud, a very famous story in which Moses goes time traveling. Could I get a volunteer to read some for us? If you're interested in reading over the course of the next hour, just say so in the chat, and I'll call on people as we go. I see Bob raising his hand. Bob, could I get you to be our first volunteer reader? And if others are willing to read later, let me know. I see already one person said so, and I'll call on you as we go. Bob, please.
Sure enough, Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, when Moses ascended on high, he found the Holy One, blessed be he, sitting and tying crowns on the letters of the Torah. Moses said before God, Master of the universe, who is detaining you that you spend so much time on this? God said to him, there's a man who is destined to be born after several generations, and Akiva ben Yosef is his name. He is destined to derive from each and every thorn of these crowns mounds upon mounds of halachot.
Let me stop you for a second, Bob. Thank you. So Moses is up on top of Mount Sinai. God is writing the Torah. Right now, whether we believe this literally or not doesn't matter. This is the story the rabbis are telling. God is writing the Torah, and God is putting crowns, decorative crowns, on the tops of some of the letters. Some of you have probably seen this before. I should have brought a picture of it, but I didn't. But that there are these decorative crowns on tops of certain letters in the Torah. We might look at those and we might say, that's neat decoration. A scribe put that there for this to look cool, to look neat. The rabbis have a different view on it. The rabbis suggest that this is there because someday a teacher named Akiva ben Yosef, this is Rabbi Akiva, who will live 1,000 years after Moses, will derive mounds and mounds of halachot from the crowns. In other words, meaning in the Torah is not only made in the sentences of the Torah, not only made in the words of the Torah, not only in the letters, but even in the crowns upon the letters. Meaning in the Torah is made in all of these different ways and places. And that's some of what the rabbis have to say here. Bob, can I ask you to go on, please?
Moses said before God, Master of the universe, show him to me. God said to him, turn around. Moses went and sat at the end of the 8th row in Rabbi Akiva's study hall and did not understand what they were saying. Moses' strength waned. When Rabbi Akiva arrived at the discussion of one matter, his students said to him, My teacher, from where do you derive this? Rabbi Akiva said to them, It is a halakha transmitted to Moses from Sinai. When Moses heard this, his mind was put at ease.
All right, thank you, Bob. So when it says Moses' strength waned, it means something like Moses was distressed. What is Moses distressed by? He has leaped forward 1,000 years in time. This is Moses's Back to the Future moment, right? He jumps in his DeLorean and he zooms forward 1,000 years in time, sits down in Rabbi Akiva's classroom. Now it's interesting that he sits in the 8th row. What is the meaning of Moses sitting in the 8th row? It means that Moses is one of the weakest students in the class, right? Because the way that the ancient academy was organized, for better or for worse, and this is not great pedagogy, was that the strongest students, the strongest disciples would be closest to the rabbi, and then you would go from there. So Moses is sitting in the back of the classroom and sits down and does not understand what they're saying. Now, somebody help me out by raising your hand. Why doesn't Moses understand what Rabbi Akiva is talking about in his classroom? This is Moses, right? Moses received the Torah from Sinai as far as the rabbis are concerned. Moses is the great lawgiver of Judaism, yet he doesn't understand what Rabbi Akiva is talking about. Bob, yeah, why doesn't he understand?
The minimum answer is Akiva was speaking Aramaic and Moses spoke Hebrew, so he just didn't understand the language.
Perhaps. One second, sorry. I'm choking on my water here. Ira, you want to add to that?
I was just thinking, I guess to this day, no one understands what those crowns actually mean. So it's like the Torah is a living thing that every generation they get more and more from it. So 1,000 years from now, they may have gleaned things that he didn't comprehend in his time.
Right. I think that, yes. I'm not sure Bob, your answer was cute. I'm not sure I buy the language thing. I'm not sure Moses spoke Hebrew at all, which might be why he needed Aaron as a mediator. But without question, Judaism has changed a lot in 1,000 years, right? So Moses doesn't get, he just doesn't, simply doesn't understand the discussion that Rabbi Akiva is having. Lacey, you want to add to that as well?
Well, at this point in the story, Moses has just gone to receive the Torah, and traditionally we understand that he received all of the Torah, the oral Torah and everything, but he hasn't gotten all that yet. God's still tying the crowns on.
So even Moses has a lot to learn, right? Moses goes into the classroom of this great teacher and doesn't know a lot. And yet, what puts his mind at ease when Akiva suggests that there is a certain law that was received from Moses? And then the end of the story, Bob, can I get you to just read the last paragraph of the story, please?
Moses returned and came before the Holy One, blessed be he, and said before him, Master of the universe, you have a man such as this, and yet you give the Torah through me? God said to him, Be silent. This intention arose before me.
Which is God's way of saying, I've made up my mind. Shut up, Moses. I've made up my mind. You, Moses suggests that God should give the Torah to Rabbi Akiva instead. God says, no, this is how I'm going to do it. I'm giving it to you. Akiva will live 1,000 years from now, and this is the Judaism that is being handed down. So let's take a step back for a second. What are the rabbis? I'm not suggesting that this story is true. This is a story that the rabbis tell about Torah, about Judaism. What are the rabbis trying to teach about Judaism through this swashbuckling time travel story? Ira, go ahead.
Well, back to that idea of evolution, the oral tradition before the Talmud was codified was, I believe, not written down specifically so that it could evolve. And it wasn't until after the Second Temple period ended that they thought, well, we better take a snapshot of this before it gets lost. And so this concept of Judaism evolving from Mount Sinai till now is, I think, what it's maybe trying to say.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Judaism evolves over time. Moses doesn't understand Rabbi Akiva's Judaism, not because Moses is stupid, not because Moses doesn't know the Torah, although, as Lacey points out, it was relatively new to him, but he's still Moses. He knows the Torah, at least in its basics. He doesn't understand it because it has changed so much. And the rabbis are not suggesting that's a bad thing, because in the end, God says, no, this is what I have decided. This is the way Judaism is to be. Anne, you want to add to that?
I agree with Ira, but I also think that probably Moses was more concerned with the written, and this is more the oral tradition, and it's meant to evolve.
Yeah, so I'm glad you raised this issue of a written and an oral Torah. One of the things that's embedded into this story is that there is a traditional belief in Judaism that not only was Moses handed the written Torah, the Torah as we, as a scroll like we have in our synagogues at Sinai, but God also whispered into Moses' ear all of the ideas, the traditions that would ever arise around Judaism. And Moses passed that on to the next generation, and they to the next, and they to the next, so that in the end, the Judaism consists not only of a written book, but also of a set of interpretations, ever-growing interpretations that grow up around that book that make up the way of life that we call Judaism. In fact, the second text, and I'll send this out, by the way, if people want to look at it later on, but the second text here explicitly makes that point. This is from the beginning of Mishnah Avot. Mishnah is part of the Talmud, and this is where the rabbis essentially give their raison d'etre. This is the rabbinic sort of justification for how rabbinic Judaism comes to be. It says Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua. Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the Great Assembly. The men of the Great Assembly is a kind of a mythical body of leaders that is supposed to have existed from the time of Ezra after the destruction of the First Temple down to essentially the late Second Temple period. The latest of the men of the Great Assembly are the earliest of the rabbis. So here, in this one sentence really, the rabbis give their one sentence history of where Judaism comes from. Torah, they say, was received by Moses and handed down from generation to generation until it got to us, the latest of the decisors of Judaism. This is not unlike if you go to a bar or bat mitzvah and you see the Torah being handed from parents to children. Some people have seen that ritual before. By the way, that's not an old ritual. That's a relatively recent ritual in North American synagogue. Maybe it happens in other places now as well. But it's a new ritual that represents this idea that Torah is handed down from generation to generation. Every generation makes it new in a way. Every generation has new interpretations, different ideas about what the Torah means, and we receive what others gave us, and then we make it our own and we pass it on yet again. That's why Moses didn't understand what Rabbi Akiva was doing, because of 1,000 years of continual interpretation of Judaism. That, in a sense, is oral Torah. And that's really important, that the rabbis believe that Judaism resides not only in the written text, but in the oral traditions around the text as well. Sarah, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, when did it become understood that we understand Torah when we have met together and disagreed totally on the meaning, in those whether it's in our chavruta or in larger groups, that debate, that digging in is what really allows us to kind of excavate the deepest meanings of Torah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And truly, that's a question that deserves its own whole hour. I actually recently taught a class here at La Asok that was about that question of why are the rabbis so invested in debate as the vehicle of learning? I think, by the way, and I didn't make this up, I'm learning this from other scholars, that the rabbis are invested in debate because they are afraid of sectarianism. They saw that the period, and we'll see this in a minute, we're going to look at some history. They saw that the late Second Temple period, call it like the 1st century CE, was a time of deep sectarianism, hatred between different Jewish groups that had differing interpretations of Torah. They're very much, and they believe that that was what brought down the temple. They believe that that was what brought destruction upon the Jewish people. So they crafted a new kind of Judaism that in which you could disagree and debate and still be on the same team, essentially, where the discussion and the disagreement and the argumentation was built into the process rather than being the downfall of the process. But I'm getting away from myself a little bit. So let's actually we're going to see some of that in our timeline that we're about to look at. Let me show you one more text, and then I want to look at a historical timeline here. This is also from the Babylonian Talmud. This is the story of Hillel and Shammai. Hillel and Shammai are two sages who live around the year 0, who are actually, to Sarah's point, known for disagreeing with each other. Let's see, could I get, I don't know if you pronounce your name Aliyah or Aliyah. Would you be willing to read this paragraph for us, please?
Sure, I'd be happy to. The sages taught there was an incident involving one Gentile who came before Shammai. The Gentile said to Shammai, "How many Torahs do you have?" He said to him, "Two, the written Torah and the oral Torah." The Gentile said to him, "With regard to the written Torah, I believe you, but with regard to the oral Torah, I do not believe you. Convert me on condition that you will teach me only the written Torah." Shammai scolded him and cast him out with reprimand.
I'm going to stop you for just a second, Aliyah, if you don't mind. So this is a very familiar, sort of common Talmudic trope of, somebody comes before two rabbis with a kind of an obnoxious question. And Shammai, for those who don't know, Shammai, not known for his bedside manner, particularly, like not known for his kindness. There's another story where Shammai picks up a big bat and chases the guy out of the room. Hillel is always known as the kinder one, the better listener, the more lenient one. In this case, what is the obnoxious question, such as it is? The question or the claim is, I don't believe that there are really two Torahs. There's a written Torah. I can see the words of it right in front of me. I will be Jewish. Just give me the Torah and let me figure it out for myself, essentially, right? That's the claim that's being made. I don't need any kind of oral Torah, any kind of interpretive tradition. Just give me the written Torah, convert me on the condition that you teach me only the written Torah. And from there, I'll figure it out by myself. Shammai says, no way, no how, get out of here. Now, Aliyah, if you'll read the second paragraph, what does Hillel do in the same situation?
The same Gentile came before Hillel, who converted him and began teaching him Torah. On the first day he showed him the letters of the Aleph-Bet and said to him, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet. The next day he reversed the order of the letters and told him that an Aleph is a Tav, and so on. The convert said to him, But yesterday you did not tell me that. Hillel said to him, Didn't you rely on me then? You should also rely on me with regard to the matter of the oral Torah.
All right, thank you, Aliyah. Anybody want to interpret for us? What's the point? What's the lesson? What's the Aesop's fable moral of the story here? I see Anne. Go ahead.
I think that he's asking him to consider that far smarter people than him will comment on these things and he will benefit from it.
Okay, consider that others have, I'm bristling at your language of smarter, but certainly maybe more knowledgeable people, right? Have had things to say about this. So why would you think that you just have to know what everything means without in any way listening to those who have had other interpretations? Sarah, go ahead.
Well, a letter is simply a signifier, and how we interpret that particular signifier is open to interpretation. And to me, that's what Hillel's saying.
Yeah, in some way, there is no such thing as not having interpretation. When we read something, we are experiencing interpretation, even the letters, right? I rely on you to teach me how to read. I am relying on an interpretive tradition. So there's no such thing as not interpreting Torah as we read it, which means that by definition, there is an oral Torah. There is an interpretive tradition around the Torah. Ira, last word on this? Oh, Ira, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Well, when we studied like in these groups, Torah study, we always study as a group, and all of us are interpreting it in different ways. And when we look at the Midrash, sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't agree. But I think it would be a shame if we didn't take into account what our ancestors thought about this, because they had some really good insights. If we had to start over every generation, it would just be not as good as if we could rely on the teachings of the past. So it's not like you have to believe it or not believe it, but you should listen to it or try to learn from it.
Yeah, I like that. In the end, Judaism is a multi-generational experience. Judaism, I like to think, is a conversation that we are having, that we are participating in with the generations of our people that we've been having for a very long time, right? And in the end, the message of these stories that we've looked at so far has been something like that Judaism relies on the interpretive tradition, what the rabbis call the oral Torah. That's an integral part of our tradition. Why are we talking so much about oral Torah? Because the Talmud, in the end, is in some way a codification of oral tradition. It's a bringing together and a writing down, sort of interpretive tradition around Judaism. So let's look at some timeline and we'll see how the Talmud comes about as a document. Again, I'm going to send this out afterwards so you don't have to memorize all this, and there's more in this timeline than what we're actually going to look at. But I want to point out a few highlights of Jewish history. In the year 586 BCE, the first temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, and the Jews are exiled into the Babylonian Empire. It is during this time of the Babylonian exile that the texts that we now know as the Torah, and in many ways the Tanakh, the Bible, begin to be written down, edited, coalescing into a document that over hundreds of years comes to be something resembling the Torah. In Judaism and in Jewish history, writing and creativity is often a response to tragedy in some way. We see this here in the time of the Babylonian exile, when the Jews begin to write down their stories, possibly for fear that they would be lost, right? In some ways, the Bible is this compendium of so many stories and texts and laws to put them all together so that we won't lose them now that we've been exiled from our land. So many people have been killed. And we're also seeking a new way to be Jewish, right? In exile. So the Torah becomes that sort of lightning rod around which Judaism will coalesce in that period of time. Then 80 years later, the Jews are allowed, at least some are allowed, to return to the land of Israel. They rebuild the temple, and thus begins what we call the Second Temple period. The Second Temple period lasts hundreds of years, and during that time, Judea, or what is now called Yehud, which means Judah in Persian, comes first under the Persians, then under Alexander and the Greeks, and then various Greek empires, Syrian Greek Empire, Egyptian Greek Empire. This is your Hanukkah story where the Jews are fighting against the army of the Syrian Greeks. The Jews move around the Mediterranean basin. They translate the Torah into Greek in what we now call the Septuagint. The Maccabees fight back and establish an independent Jewish state at Jerusalem. And over time, and then ultimately Rome takes over, right? In the late first century, the Jews rebel against Rome, and it doesn't go well. I'm obviously telescoping this history into a very short period of time. But it's this destruction of the Second Temple that brings about ultimately what we know today as the Talmud, in a way that I'll describe in just a moment. The temple in Jerusalem during the Second Temple period is the most crucial institution of Jewish life. It is the center of Jewish life. Geographically, Jews live all around now the Persian and Mediterranean, but the middle of that is Jerusalem in many ways. It is also the religious center of Jewish life. Jews all over the world, although they were beginning to have their own synagogues and have their own, ways of being Jewish in diaspora, they still had a loyalty to the temple in Jerusalem. They still sent money to the temple in Jerusalem. They had a kind of an affinity with the state in the land of Israel, as well as the temple that was in the land of Israel. The temple is also the administrative and political center of the Jewish world, as well as religiously. It was the place where sacrifice took place. It was the place where heaven was understood to touch earth, where God's presence was understood to rest, and where the priests would offer sacrifice on behalf of the entire Jewish people. That was the place where God's holiness was brought to rest in the world. And yet in the year 70, the Romans flatten Jerusalem and destroy the temple. The story goes, and I have this as a text, but I think I'll tell the story instead of reading the story. The story goes that in the waning days of the rebellion in the year 70, the leader of the rabbinic community in Jerusalem, whose name was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, saw the writing on the wall, and he had himself smuggled out of the city of Jerusalem in a coffin, essentially, because that was the only way to get out of the besieged city. And he had himself snuck out of Jerusalem that way, and he went to see the general Vespasian, who was the general that was administering the war against Jerusalem and against Judea. He goes to him and he says, "Hail Caesar." And Vespasian says, "I'm not Caesar." And just at that moment, the story goes in. One of Vespasian's men comes in and says, "The emperor is dead. You're the new emperor." And so Vespasian turns to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and says, "You predicted that I would be the emperor. I'll grant you one wish." Right? It's probably not a true story, but it's a good story anyway. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's answer to Vespasian is, "I know that Jerusalem is lost. So instead, give me Yavne and give me the sages, and let me gather them there." Now, Yavne is a city to the northwest of Jerusalem, and it was not an important city. And so asking for Yavna in some ways was sort of like no skin off the back of the new emperor. He's about to flatten Jerusalem. He doesn't care about Yavna. So he says to Yochanan ben Zakkai, to this rabbi, sure, you can have Yavna, and I will spare the family of Rabban Gamliel, and you can bring them there. So after the war, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, at least according to the story, goes about gathering and finding all the sages that he can that he can find, and gathers them at Yavna, in this little city just to the northwest of the now destroyed Jerusalem. He brings the sages together, and they begin a project of of saving and reinventing Judaism. They gather together all of the teachings that have been passed down to them over the generations, from their teachers, from their teachers, and so on and so forth. All of the laws, the stories, everything they have, which has all been oral up until this point, they bring it together and they begin to collate it. So let's talk for just a minute about why they would do that. What would be the goodness? What would be the purpose of these rabbis launching this project, collating all of these teachings, organizing, bringing together, maybe even writing down all of these teachings? I see Rachel's hand up. Go ahead, Rachel.
Well, because they understood that now the Jews would be living in diaspora and there would not be a temple. And so there had to be some other way of connecting the faith and the people of the faith.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they understood now that something had fundamentally changed about Judaism. No more temple. The temple has just been destroyed. Something has to replace the temple. No more Jerusalem, although there actually were still Jews in Jerusalem at that point, but 75 years later, there would be no Jews in Jerusalem after the second rebellion, right? So something has to replace this. Aliyah, go ahead and tell me if I'm saying your name right.
It's basically right. It's not like the emphasis on the A so much. It's like
Okay,
Alia.
Aliyah. All right, go ahead.
I think they realized how fragile that the humanity was that they were around, and they needed to make sure that if all of them hadn't been spared by like some miracle, that they would be able to pass it on. Because the only reason that they were able to convene in Yavne was because the Yochanan ben Zakkai was able to be there at just the right time. So if that didn't happen, there would be nobody to pass it on. So they needed to have a concrete way to be able to have this tradition be passed on.
Great. Yeah, I think this is all true. And of course, lots of them hadn't survived, right? So in that generation, what we call the generation of Yavne, they were keenly aware of the danger that they were facing because so many of their own compatriots had died in the war as well. Bob, you want to add to that?
I think that the desire to organize this oral tradition into some kind of a structure was so important now because the temple and the temple practice had been destroyed, and they recognized that there wasn't going to be a third time of a charm. And right after, I think, after a vote comes Barachot, and the first issue is, what time are you supposed to say the Shema? Well, at the same time that the evening sacrifice was to be given.
Right, exactly. And actually we're gonna look at that passage in just a few minutes. So I like what you said, Bob, about sort of a desire to organize, right? They had all these teachings, but imagine if you had a bunch of teachings on a bunch of scraps of paper and you threw them up in the air and they go everywhere. That's what had happened, except it was sitting all in the minds of these sages. So there was some kind of an impulse to bring it together and organize it. At first, probably orally, and we don't know to what extent these early compilations were written down versus compiled orally, but certainly with a desire to bring it together and organize it. And if I can return to our timeline here, we can see that in the year 70, Yochanan ben Zakkai establishes the academy at Yavne, and it took around 130 to 150 years for them to finally bring all of that together into a book that becomes known as the Mishnah. The Mishnah, which is the first law code of Judaism, other than the Torah, which is not really a law code. The Mishnah is the first rabbinic law code, and it is the product of those 150 years or so of compiling all of these traditions. And it's codified by a rabbi named Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Yehuda the prince, or Rabbi Yehuda the patriarch, who is, at least according to tradition, the great-great-great-great-grandfather of Hillel that we talked about earlier, and part of that family of Rabban Gamliel that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had asked the emperor to please save. So this is the family. Now, that family probably wrote themselves into the text, right? I have some suspicions about which is the chicken and which is the egg here, but nonetheless, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is responsible for the compiling of the book called the Mishnah, which is the first layer, the first stratum of what we call the Talmud today. Now, the Mishnah lays out it lays out Jewish law in a bunch of tractates. And you can see here, again, I'm going to send this out to all of you. You can see here the names and the subject matter of the various tractates. It starts with brachot, which is Hebrew for benedictions or blessings. And then we have tractates about various agricultural things like tithing and gleanings. We have a number of tractates about Shabbat and festivals. You can see here Sukkah and Pesach and Rosh Hashanah and Yoma. Yoma is about Yom Kippur. We have tractates about various laws around, especially marriage. It's called Nashim, which means women. It deals especially with laws around marriage and divorce and betrothal and things like that. Tractates that are, this is essentially civil law, dealing with, Nezikin means damages in Hebrew. So here, the Bavas, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Batra, is all about civil law. That's where you get your ox law, if somebody's ox gores somebody else's ox. But there, of course, there's a lot more to it than that, right? But this is civil law. These are the laws of the Jewish people. Laws around various kinds of offerings. The last two are all about various kinds of offerings and temple-based things. Now, it's interesting to note that the rabbis did not discard the laws that had to do with temple stuff. They didn't. Now, they knew the temple was destroyed, and they knew it wasn't going to be rebuilt anytime soon. They maybe were hopeful, but the rabbis go about compiling the laws of the temple for one of two possible reasons. One is because maybe three possible reasons. One is because they hope and believe it'll be rebuilt someday soon, and they want to be ready. Number two is they are not hopeful that it's going to be rebuilt anytime soon, and they want to preserve this material, preserve these laws that did exist during the time of the temple. And number three, which I have to believe is true, is that because the rabbis maybe didn't believe the temple was going to be rebuilt anytime soon, they were looking to create a Judaism where it was not dependent on the temple, on the actual sacrifices in the temple, but rather that study replaced the act of sacrifice. So we see Midrash, for example, where the rabbis suggest that studying the laws of the sacrifice is the same as actually performing a sacrifice. The rabbis suggest that praying is the same as or equal in holiness or force to the act of performing a sacrifice in the temple. We see the rabbis, I was just studying in our Talmud group, which a couple of you are in today, a statement that billeting a rabbi, putting a rabbi up in your home, giving them a place to stay while they're in town teaching, is equal to offering a sacrifice in the temple. Now, is that self-serving? Maybe. The rabbis are writing this stuff. But nonetheless, the rabbis are asserting that there are holy acts that are equivalent to offering sacrifice in the temple: prayer, study, reciting blessings, giving to the poor. These acts actually take on all the holiness that sat in that ancient temple, which was the place where heaven and earth meets, and all of that is transferred now to us as individuals. So the Mishnah is a code of law teaching us how to be Jewish. It should be the last book you ever need on Judaism, right? It tells you everything, how to do what, how do you observe Shabbat, how do you observe marriage, what are the laws of sacrifices, what are the laws of this and that. What happens? The Mishnah is codified in the year 200, and then the rabbis spend the next 300 years arguing about it. And this is where we get into what Sarah asked about before. When does argumentation become an important part of Judaism? The answer is that from the very beginning, we're going to see in a minute, the very first Mishnah in the Mishnah already has 3 different opinions on something. Literally, I'm not even exaggerating. And so the rabbis seem to believe that the act of arguing over Torah is in itself a sacred act. And so after they compile the Mishnah, they spend 300 years arguing about what the Mishnah means. And over the course of those 300 years, they compile a whole bunch of new teachings from rabbis who are now interpreting and teaching and passing things on to their teachers. And so that by the 5th century, there's a whole new literature of interpretation and story and law and elucidation and clarification about the Mishnah. And that literature, in around the year, here I'll show my screen one more time, in around the year 500-ish, 600-ish, in the 5th to 6th century, is compiled into a book that we call the Talmud. There are 2 Talmuds. There's a Jerusalem Talmud. It's called the Jerusalem Talmud or the Palestinian Talmud because it was compiled in the land of Israel. In Hebrew, it's usually called the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, even though it was actually probably compiled in Tiberias, not in Jerusalem. And it happens a little earlier, around the time that the Roman emperor goes Christian, probably or possibly because the Jews now there was a different danger on Judaism, so they needed to write their stuff down. About 100 to 150 years later, the same thing happens in Babylonia, where the Jews, for various political and security reasons, begin to put down all of these teachings, organize all of these teachings into a compilation known as the Talmud. So the Talmud is made up of 2 strata. The first strata of the Talmud is always the Mishnah. The Mishnah is that year 200 law code that we talked about. The second stratum of the Talmud is what we call the Gemara. Gemara in Hebrew, Gemar means to complete, but in Aramaic it means to teach. So the Gemara is the teaching or the interpretation on the Mishnah, which actually makes up the majority of the Talmud. I don't know if you can see on my shelf back there, the Mishnah here. This is the Mishnah. This is English only edition, the old Danby edition, that gives you a sense of how long it is, right? If it was in Hebrew, it might be even a little shorter because Hebrew is, more compact than English. The Gemara, the Talmud itself, takes up that second shelf and then some, and I don't have the whole thing. So just to give us a sense of how much Gemara there is, how much more interpretation there is than the actual original law code. The Talmud is essentially a record of rabbis arguing about Judaism, discussing, debating, and then somebody 300 years later, and this somebody traditionally is Ravina and Rav Ashi, took all of those teachings and set them into discussions, often artificial discussions between rabbis who never sat in the same room with each other, who might have lived several hundred years apart from one another. So the Talmud, the Gemara, and I'm going to show you this in a minute, what this looks like as we look at the actual text. The Gemara or the Talmud is in the end a kind of an imagined conversation that the editors, the redactors of the Talmud created by setting statements from various rabbis in various time periods beside each other because they had something to say about something related to each other. And sometimes those people are actually responding to each other, and sometimes not. Sometimes it's much more of a stream of consciousness because the Talmud became, in the end, a kind of a, what's the word for it? A kind of a storehouse for all of the creativity of the rabbinic period, which means that, for example, in Tractate Brachot, which is about blessings, it will start off talking about what time you're supposed to say the evening Shema, and end up talking about why King David had a sacred alarm clock, or why it's important to pray in community inside of a synagogue. So the Talmud is a kind of a meandering, wandering discussion, redacted by, a group of sages in the 5th or 6th century, taking the material of the previous 300 to 400 years and constructing conversations out of it. Now, in a minute, I'm going to show you what that looks like, both physically as well as textually. But let me stop for a couple of short questions before I go on. So, Aviva, go ahead.
I guess they didn't see COVID coming, did they?
What do you mean by that?
If they wanted you to be praying communally?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you ask that. Because in Tractate Brachot, the tractate that deals with blessings, there is a very interesting discussion about what do you do about communal prayer when you're sick. In fact, the rabbis in some ways invented the Zoom minyan. That's not the passage I brought for us today, but there is a really interesting story where Rabbi Yitzchak, I think, goes to see Rav Nachman and says, why weren't you in shul today? And Rav Nachman says, well, I wasn't sick. So Rabbi Yitzchak, and I think it's Yitzchak, but I might be wrong, says to him, I tell you what, tomorrow we're going to send a runner to you to let you know when we're starting our prayer so that you can pray at the same time. In other words, they recognized the importance of praying together with the community even when you couldn't be physically together with the community. And that conversation comes as part of Tractate Brachot when the rabbis are talking about the importance of prayer. So it's a great example of how they sort of meander their discussions, ultimately talking not only about the laws themselves, but actually about all the things that matter in Jewish life, which is why the Talmud is, in the end, the compendium of things that mattered to the rabbis and things that mattered in Jewish life. I see a couple of questions in the chat from Ira. Is this the beginning of what we call Rabbinic Judaism? Yes, Rabbinic Judaism is the Judaism framed by the rabbis in the post-temple period. It is these days pretty much the only form of Judaism there is, right? There were Karaites at one point. There's not a lot of them left. All of the Judaisms that we observe today, no matter what denomination we're part of, are in some way rabbinic or post-rabbinic forms of Judaism. It's the rabbis who frame the blessings of the Amidah. It's the rabbis who create all those blessings for lighting candles and eating challah and things like that, right? That is, even those of us that are liberal Jews, which I imagine we are because that's why we're here, when we are pushing back and saying, we have the right to make our own choices about how we will observe things, the tradition that we are part of and that we're pushing back against is the rabbinic Jewish tradition. So let me show you, I said I'd show you what this looks like. So here's what it actually literally looks like. This is a page of the Talmud from what's called the Vilna edition, which was printed in 1600s, 16 something. And this is, if you pick up the Talmud these days, this is what it will look like. This is actually the first page of the Talmud. This is page 2a of Tractate Brachot. Where's page 1, you might ask? Page 1 is the title page. It's that simple. This is the beginning of the Talmud, where it begins by asking, Me'ematai korin et Shema be'aravin. What time do we say the Shema in the evening? That's the first question of Judaism. What time do you say the evening Shema? And what you're looking at here is in the middle of the text, Mishnah, right here. The first 10 lines or so are the Mishnah, up to, and I know this is not easy to see, but up to this little Gimel Mem, you see this Gimel Mem that I'm circling right here? Gimel Mem stands for Gemara. So this is where the Gemara on that first Mishnah begins. This is Mishnah 1 of chapter 1 of Tractate Brachot, of which that first chapter has 5 Mishnayot, and there are about 5 chapters of Tractate Brachot. Anybody want to take a guess in the chat how long the Gemara goes on for this first Mishnah? So you can see this Mishnah is 10 lines, right? How long is the Gemara for the first Mishnah? Just somebody guess. How many lines? How many paragraphs? 100 lines, Ira suggests. Okay. Any other guesses? 10,000? Perhaps. I don't actually know how many lines it is. All I know is that the second Mishnah comes around page 10 of Tractate Brachot. So in other words, 10 lines yields 10 pages of discussion. And that is what traditional Jews do when they study Talmud, right? When we study Talmud, we're engaging with the rabbis in discussion that they were having. We're participating in the conversations because these conversations often still matter to us, even as liberal Jews. So let me show you what this looks like textually. Okay, I have to race through this because I only have 6 minutes left, but it'll at least give you an idea. Oh, sorry. To answer Caroline's question, I did want to respond to that. What are all these other columns? So in the middle here you have Mishnah and then Gemara, right? This is the 2nd century. This is 5th century commentary or expansion or whatever you want to call the Gemara on that. And then what are all these other columns? These are commentaries. So here we have Rashi's commentary. Rashi is the 12th century commentator par excellence on the Talmud. He also, by the way, is the commentator par excellence on the Torah and the Bible and the Hebrew Bible. Over here are what are called the Tosafot. Tosafot is a group of scholars that are led especially by...
I saw it.
Sorry, somebody's unmuted. If you could just mute yourself, please. Tosafot are a group of scholars living a couple generations after Rashi, because several of them are his grandsons, who deal more with difficult quandaries. Rashi just tells you what's going on in the text. The Tosafot deal with more difficult quandaries in the text. And then we have other commentaries that come from other times after that. So Rabbeinu Hananel over here. Somewhere we have Hagahot Habach, right, which is right here. The Ein Mishpat Ner Mitzvah tells you where in the Torah you can find whatever conversations are going on in the Talmud. So a page of Talmud essentially contains a bunch of commentaries around it. What's in the middle of the page will often look like this. I'm going to try to do this in 5 minutes or less. In the Torah, in the Shema, it says that we should recite the words of the Shema, or at least it says that we should recite the words that God commanded us when you lie down and when you rise up. You might know these words in Hebrew. Beshoch becha uvkumecha. You might know how to chant the Shema and the Ve'ahavta, right? These are daily words that we say, every morning, every evening we say the Shema. Why? Anybody know why you say the Shema every morning and every evening in Judaism? Why is that an important Jewish practice, to say the Shema every day, every morning and every evening? Bob, please.
Well, your soul may come and go, and you want to be in contact through prayer before you go to sleep, and your soul may depart, and in the morning when you're grateful that it's back again.
Okay, that's nice. It's a good spiritual answer. I was asking more of a structural answer. Who says that we should say the Shema every evening and every morning? And the answer in a way is that the Shema itself says it, right? When you lie down and when you rise up. Except that it doesn't exactly say that. It is in fact the rabbis of the Talmud who decide and then elucidate what that should look like. So the Talmud begins with us asking questions about this. Now, if we had a lot of time, I'd ask you, what questions arise from this? When the Torah says, when you lie down and when you rise up, what questions might you have about that? You might have a lot of questions, right? What time is that? Does that have to do with when I'm actually lying down? Or does it mean like at the time that I lie down? Should I say the Shema before I lie down? Or should I say the Shema when I'm actually physically lying down? What if I don't go to bed until, 3 in the morning? Should I have said the Shema earlier, or can I still say it at 3 in the morning? What if I don't sleep at all? Can I say the Shema at like 5:53? And then what do I then need to say the morning Shema right after that? Right? These are all the questions that arise when you are creating a legal system around Jewish practice. And so the Talmud, yes, I like that, Sarah. Should I say the Shema if I take a mid-afternoon nap? What if I do shift work and I work all night and 7 in the morning is my bedtime, right? Then do I say the evening Shema at 7 in the morning? These are all the questions that could arise. And so the Mishnah begins to explore those questions. It says, from what time may one recite Shema in the evening? And it answers, from the time that the priests enter their houses to eat the truma, which is the sacred donated food, until the end of the first watch. I'm not going to go into what all this is. Our Talmud study group has been working on this Mishnah for the last 2 years, to give you a sense. So, but you already see how the rabbis they're drilling down to the specifics, and in the process, they are creating Judaism. They are framing a practice that involves evening and morning prayer, that involves discussion and debate, right? Because Rabbi Eliezer says you can say it till the end of the first watch. The sages say until midnight, and Rabban Gamliel says until dawn. Now we have 3 opinions on until when you can say the evening Shema. And by the way, Rabban Gamliel has a neat story about his sons coming home drunk after drinking all night and asking him whether they're allowed to say the Shema in the morning, and it corroborates his opinion. So already in the earliest stratum of the rabbinic literature, the rabbis are debating how to be Jewish, and they are constructing a practice that is familiar to us today because it is the Judaism that we know today. And then there's 3, and then they go on and they ask things like, what time can you say it in the morning? And then they ask, do you have to be lying down or not, right? So Hillel and Shammai have this disagreement. And in the Gemara, they go further. And they continue to ask, why does it matter? From what verse in the Tanakh do we know that we should do all of this? What happens if this, if that, if that? And by the way, I have a couple dozen stories I want to tell you about all of this, right? So the Talmud in the end ends up being a multi-generational conversation between Jews and all of those who are part of our community, in which the rabbis frame a Judaism that is built around practice, built around prayer, around study, and around Jewish community. They understood that as the worthy replacement, worthy replacement for the sacredness of the ancient temple. And they understood what they were doing as a sacred act of building a sacred way of life. So with that, I have to end. I could go on for another hour, but we promised this would be for an hour. But what I will do is I'll do this. I want to make a quick announcement, and then I'm happy to stay on for questions if there are any. The announcement is that we have 2 different continuing study options. If you're interested, if this piqued your curiosity and when you want to study Talmud, there are 2 different options, and I'm going to offer discounts for both of them. I'll do this by email after. I'll send it out later tonight or tomorrow with a discount code for those who are interested. One of them is our ongoing Talmud study group that meets on Mondays at 1 o'clock Eastern. We are studying Tractate Brachot, which deals with blessings and prayers in Judaism, starting with the Shema. And by the way, 2.5 years later, we're still on the Shema and nowhere done with the Shema. So if you'd like to join us for that, I'd be thrilled. And that's an ongoing weekly study group of the Talmud. The other is that in January, we're going to be launching a 7-week series that's called Rabbinic Literature 101 with Rabbi Brian Stoller, who will discuss not only the Talmud, but the rabbinic literature in general, Mishnah, Talmud, Midrash, codes, philosophy, etc. What are sort of the central sources of Judaism as we know it? He's a brilliant teacher and rabbi, and he'll spend 7 weeks on that. And for those of you who are part of this group, we're going to be offering a 10% discount either on the first month of the Brachot study group, or your first month of it, or on the discussion with Rabbi Stoller. And I'll send all of that out by email along with the recording of this class. So let me now ask if there are, actually, let me say thank you for joining me for this interesting discussion. The Talmud in the end sits at the center of Jewish life, especially as a study document. And we, even as liberal Jews, we benefit from studying it and learning from it. Even when we don't agree with the rabbis, we still benefit from entering into conversation with the rabbis because so many of their concerns continue to be our religious concerns. So with that, I'll end, and I'll thank you for being here. And for those who have questions, I will stick around and be happy to answer questions for a few minutes. Ira, go ahead.
My question is Midrash
Yeah.
of Gemara? Is it like after the Talmud was completed, they weren't done commenting or something? Or
Yeah, that's a great question. So, not exactly. Midrash is okay. So, Midrash, the way we use it colloquially today, Midrash means stories about the stories in the Torah, right? So, like the Midrash of Nachshon is a story about the parting of the Red Sea, or the Midrash of Abraham smashing the idols is a story about Abraham, where Abraham comes from. But there is Midrash in the Talmud, and there is also Midrash that's not in the Talmud. The answer to that is that essentially Midrash is the way that the rabbis interface with Torah. The rabbis have two different modes of teaching Judaism. One of them is Midrash, and the other one is actually called Mishnah. You know, the book called the Mishnah. Mishnah is law code that does not tie ideas back to the Torah. So, for example, the Mishnah says you need to say the Shema every evening and every morning, but it doesn't say because it says this in the Torah. It's not an explication of Torah, right? Midrash is the way the rabbis explicate Torah through story and through interpretation. It often takes the form of story, and so that's why we understand Midrash as story. What ends up happening is that those Midrashim, those rabbinic interpretations and sort of like interfaces with the Torah, they end up both in the Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud has Midrash in it, lots of it, including the story of Abraham smashing the idols, for example. In the land of Israel, they didn't so much put their Midrash into their Talmud, they put it in separate compilations. So like Midrash Rabbah or Midrash Tanchuma, those are all from the land of Israel. Those are the Midrashim. Does that clarify it a little bit?
Yeah, it says though Gemara is commentary on Mishnah and
Yeah,
Midrash.
except that Gemara is not really commentary on Mishnah. Gemara is really like just a storehouse of all this stuff that sort of relates to the Mishnah,
Yeah, it
right?
makes
That's the
sense.
thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, what you
So,
said makes sense. Thank you.
mhm.
That helps a lot.
Anne, go ahead.
I'm having a problem because I studied Torah quite literally first many years ago, and the rabbis, to me, have made all the questions and the controversies and the doubts and the problems, and I'm finding that difficult, like you just said, about when you say the Shema. The point is you say the Shema. That's it.
Yeah.
It
So,
so I'm having a hard time with all of this.
yeah, I think you're raising a really important point for liberal Jews that we don't always care about the minutia of, does it matter if I say the Shema at 4:47 or at 5:03? Does it matter? So in our Talmud study group that meets on Mondays, we struggle with that regularly And we recognize that we come to the Talmud with a different set of values often than the rabbis did and then the Orthodox did, right? In the end, Orthodoxy still depends on some of that minutia in a different way than we do. And yet, I would suggest that it's still interesting and worthwhile to to participate in those discussions. For example, we could ask, why do the rabbis care if you say Shema at 457 versus 503, right? It may not matter to me exactly, but I am interested in why they care. I'm interested in discussions about the values behind it. So when we come to the text as liberal Jews, we do it often with it for a different reason than the Orthodox do, but with the recognition that these are still discussions that have shaped our Judaism. So when the rabbis talk, for example, about how many blessings should there be in the Amidah, like, I don't know if the thing is that we're watching them formulate our Judaism. We may not care about whether it's 457 or 503, but the fact that you say these words in this prayer book in the evening is actually a result of the fact that the rabbis had this discussion 1500 years ago. So in the end, it is our Judaism still that we're watching in formation, which is why I think it's important for liberal Jews to still study the Talmud. I want to address a couple of the questions in the chat which are related. Karen asked, who decides what new commentaries get added and do they constantly update the Talmud? And then Justin asked, why did we stop updating the Talmud? So I think those are two slightly different questions. One of them about the commentaries around the Talmud and one about the Gemara itself. The Gemara itself was closed in around, like I said before, the 5th or 6th century due to events in the Babylonian Jewish world. The academies of the Babylonian Jewish world were in decline. Things were changing politically. It was decided that it was time to bring together the discussions that had happened over the previous 300 years and codify them. The Talmud itself at some point shifted from being a process to being a book. But that doesn't mean actually that the process of discussion ended, because that's when the commentaries began. So the Talmud is in many ways the product of a particular place and time, but we continue to discuss and comment on the Talmud, which is why it's surrounded by all those commentaries. To answer Karen's question, the Vilna edition, the traditional edition of the Talmud is kind of set. It has the commentaries it has, but there are always new commentaries being written. For example, there is right now a feminist commentary that is in compilation. It's been years now. Some of the tractates are done and some are still to come. Will it someday be added to the traditional edition of the Talmud? I don't know, maybe, but we are absolutely still writing commentaries on the Talmud which relate it to our Judaism, where we ask different questions, right? I spent a semester last year studying the tractate on menstrual impurity with Dr. Tirza Meacham at the University of Toronto, and you can be sure that feminist scholars are asking different questions than the classical rabbis asked about these things, right? So we're still creating new commentaries and adding them in a larger way, if not in the actual traditional edition. Sarah, last question, please. Oh, Sarah, you're on mute.
Are we still in the rabbinic period?
That is a very good question. Oh, sorry, go ahead. I interrupted you.
No, it's okay. I just, because we no longer necessarily take to heart what those rabbis 2,000 years ago told us was most important. And in many communities, we don't even have a rabbi other than one another. And we are still evolving Judaism.
Right.
Are we really still in the rabbinic period? Or is it something else?
I could spend an hour at least on that. How long do you have? The second thing you said does not make us different from previous eras. In previous eras, there were also small communities that didn't have rabbis, right? And by the way, not everybody attended to everything the rabbis said, right? The rabbis make it clear, even in the Talmud, that there are lots of Jews that don't agree with them, don't care what they have to say. They have words for them, and they're not always nice words that they have for those people, but clearly that existed, and there were other forms of Judaism. At some point, Rabbinic Judaism won out, and that point was around 1,000 years ago, and became the normative form of Judaism. Are we now in a post-rabbinic era? I think yes. You know, I believe that the Enlightenment and the change in thinking of the last couple hundred years is as much of a sea change in Judaism as the destruction of the temple was. So in other words, I mean, I'll say this. I think the rabbis were conscious reformers of Judaism, and I use that language consciously because I'm a reform rabbi. I believe the rabbis understood themselves as reformers, not reform in the sense of progressive, but reform in the sense of creating something that stood on the shoulders of but was not the same as what came before. I believe the rabbis were self-consciously doing that. I believe that the reformers of the 19th, 20th, and 21st century are doing the same. That is to say, self-consciously creating something that stands on the shoulders of but is not the same as what came before. And when we study the Talmud, we were talking before about how we come to it with different questions. That shows to me that we're in a different era. We don't come to the Talmud to learn from it in the same way as they did 300 or 400 years ago. We come to the Talmud because it is the source of the Judaism that we're still living today, but we understand ourselves to have a different kind of autonomy and a different kind of authority. We don't grant it, we liberal Jews don't grant the Talmud the same kind of authority that the Orthodox do or that pre-modern Jews did, but we still grant it authority. And by which I mean, if you this Friday night are going to light 2 Shabbat candles and say Lahadlik Ner Shel Shabbat, and then make Kiddush, then you are living Rabbinic Judaism, because that didn't come from the Torah. It came from the Talmud. It came from the rabbis, right? So are we in a post-rabbinic age? I believe we are, but we're not in a non-rabbinic age. We're in an age that stands on the shoulders of the Talmud and the rabbis, but that makes different assumptions about authority and about autonomy and about the purpose that religion plays in our lives. So with that, I think we will end. Thank you everybody for this discussion. I'll send out this recording, and just a reminder that we will have those 2 learning opportunities, and I'll send more information about those in the email that will come to you tomorrow. Thanks everybody. Have a really good rest of your week.